The 17th century era throughout history doesn't get nearly enough credit. Ask someone to name a historically important century and they'll probably say the 20th. What they know about the period is 2 world wars, the infamous atomic bomb, and the very controversial moon landing. The 1600s tend to get skipped over in that conversation, which is a mistake, because in 100 years, this century managed to fit in the union of England and Scotland, partaking in a 30-year war that redesigned the map of Europe and invented the modern concept of national sovereignty. Additionally, Isaac Newton's publishing is arguably the most important scientific work in human history. Not bad for a century nobody puts on their list. Here's 7 7th century events and how they unfolded, but also why they still matter. England began the 17th century with a succession crisis it had been quietly dreading for decades. Queen Elizabeth I had just died in March 1603 without an heir. She had never married, which was a deliberate political choice that had served her well during her reign, but created a real problem at the end of it. The solution was to look north for the coming of James VI from Scotland, and he had a legitimate claim through his great-grandmother, Henry VIII's sister. He was already a functioning monarch with experience governing a difficult kingdom. In theory, he was the right choice, but as far as in practice, bringing together 2 nations that deeply distrusted each other was never going to be entirely smooth. James was crowned King James I of England and Ireland in 1603. This was of the first time that 2 kingdoms shared a single monarch, an arrangement that technically created the Kingdom of Great Britain, although full political union wouldn't come until 1707. Within 2 years, he was the target of one of the most audacious assassination plots in British history. A group of Catholic conspirators, frustrated by James's failure to deliver the religious tolerance he had seemed to promise before taking the throne, hatched a plan to blow up the Houses of Parliament on November 5, 1605. Guy Fawkes is the name history remembered, though he was actually just the man caught in the basement guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder. The ringleader was actually a man named Robert Catesby, who tends to get far less attention than he probably deserves. The plot was discovered through an anonymous letter warning a Catholic lord to stay away from Parliament that day. The conspirators were arrested and executed in the horrific manner the era reserved for traitors. Fawkes's face became the mask of the whole enterprise, partly because he was the one dramatically caught, and partly because history tends to remember the dramatic moment rather than the planning behind it. In remembrance, England still burns effigies on November 5th every year. Guy Fawkes is simultaneously the most celebrated failure in British history and, depending on one's views, something of a folk hero. James left a more lasting mark through a project he commissioned, producing a new English translation of the Bible, what became the King James Version, completed in 1611 after 7 years of work by a committee of 47 scholars. This Bible became of the most widely used scriptures in history today. More than that, it became a significant force in standardizing the English language during their expansion across the world. They did so through trade, colonization, and the migration we'll get to shortly. Its rhythms and phrases worked their way into English-speaking culture to a point that people quote it without knowing they're quoting it. That committee of scholars left fingerprints on the English language that are still visible 400 years later. Russia, meanwhile, was living through exactly the kind of chaos that the name Time of Troubles promises. The Rurikid dynasty, which had ruled Russia for centuries, ended without an heir when Tsar Fyodor I died in 1598. The ending result was a political crisis that got worse at almost every turn. The famine of 1601 to 1603 killed hundreds of thousands of people across Russia, destabilizing an already fragile situation. Then would come the false Dimitris, who were a series of men who claimed to be Dmitri while being the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible. Ivan recently fell short when he died under disputed circumstances in 1591. The first false Dmitri was convincing enough, or at least had enough Polish and Cossack military backing to actually seize the throne in 1605. He sat on it for almost a year before being assassinated in a coup. A second false Dmitri later emerged, claiming the first had survived. This one never took over Moscow but controlled enough territory to create a parallel court and genuine civil conflict. all of which was made significantly worse by Poland, who had been meddling in Russian affairs and finally made its move in 1610, capturing Moscow by installing a Polish candidate as Tsar. Russia ended the troubles by choosing stability over everything else. Michael Romanov, 16 years old and with the right family connections to satisfy enough of the competing factions, was elected Tsar in 1613. The Romanov dynasty that began that day would rule Russia for the next 300 years, right up to the Revolution of 1917. The Time of Troubles is a useful case study in what happens when a state has no succession plan and attracts opportunistic neighbors all at once. Russia survived it at the time, yet a lot of the people living through it did not. Now, when you fast forward, both Russia and Ukraine is facing more troubles again. Stepping over to the 30 Years' War is another big event in this era, because its consequences reached further than what's thought about European history. It started in 1618 with a fairly specific incident. The King of Bohemia attempted to impose Catholicism on a population that had been largely Protestant since the Reformation decades earlier. Protestants in Prague responded by throwing 2 royal governors and their secretary out of a third-floor window, cheerfully known as the Defenestration of Prague. The governors survived, landing in a pile of rubbish below, and Catholic sources claimed it was a miracle. Conversely, Protestant sources pointed out it was a very large pile of rubbish. As said in the name, what followed was 30 years of war that pulled in virtually every significant European power and ravaged the continent for reasons that shifted as the conflict went on. The Holy Roman Empire became the primary battlefield, and the religious conflict between Catholic and Protestant powers was real. But so was the territorial opportunism of states using the chaos to expand their borders. France, nominally Catholic, funded and supported Protestant forces against the Habsburgs because weakening the Habsburgs was more important to French interests than religious solidarity. Sweden decided to intervene militarily. Spain sent money on top of fleets of soldiers. Whenever Denmark made their attempts in joining, they failed. Those, such as the Dutch, used the cover of the conflict to push their own independence from Spain further along. The human cost was staggering. Some estimates put the population loss in certain German states at 25 to 40%. Cities were sacked, which means all farmland was destroyed and left unworked. This took generations to recover from because the war created refugee populations and broke apart communities. It ended with a series of treaties that did more than end the fighting. In 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia, they established a principle that's new to ever have been codified, that nation-states are sovereign within their own borders, while those outside powers have no legitimate authority to interfere in another state's internal religious or political arrangements. In this case, the signatories recognize each other as equals in international relations. This principle of Westphalian sovereignty became the foundation of international law and international relations in the political system. The modern system of nation-states is an organization called the United Nations, where the framework is based on how countries interact. In September 1620, 102 Puritan passengers and a crew of around 30 left Plymouth, England, aboard a ship called the Mayflower. They had decided the Church of England was beyond reform and wanted to start something new in North America. The crossing took 10 weeks. It competed with Atlantic storms that threatened to sink the ship. A main beam cracked mid-voyage and was repaired with a large iron screw. There was a few that fell short at sea. When finally they arrived on November 21st, 1620, establishing the Plymouth colony in Cape Cod. That first winter nearly killed the colony before it had a chance to become anything. Around half of the original settlers died before spring. The ones who survived did so partly through the help of the Wampanoag people, particularly a man named Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto spoke English, and with his extensive wisdom chose to help the struggling colonists. The relationship between the settlers and the Wampanoag was more confusing than what is described. It involved cooperation alongside misunderstandings, featuring a power dynamic that would devastate the indigenous population as more settlers came. But in that first year, help came from the people who already lived there. The idea of crossing the Atlantic to build something new proved contagious. The migration that followed over the next decades changed North American culture forever. It contributes a significant amount to how the United States thinks about itself, tracing back to those 102 passengers and their terrible 10 weeks at sea. In China, the Ming dynasty, which had governed since 1368, was coming apart at the seams. The late 16th and early 17th centuries had stacked disaster on top of disaster. Major earthquakes killed hundreds of thousands. Even the government's ability to respond to any of it was increasingly compromised by a court culture that had put power struggles first. Since that was put over fair governing, the empire's weakness became visible from the outside. A Manchu warlord named Nurhaci had been watching from the north for years. He declared war on the Ming in 1618 and spent the following decades picking off northern territory while the dynasty struggled. When Beijing fell in 1644 to a separate rebel army under Li Zicheng, the Manchus moved with decisive speed. Li Zicheng controlled Beijing, but not the loyalty of the Ming general Wu Sangui, who commanded the strategic pass at Shanhai. Wu Sangui made a fateful choice. He opened the pass to the Manchus rather than submit to the rebels. The Manchus then defeated Li Zicheng, took Beijing, and installed Nurhaci's grandson Shunji as the first Qing emperor. The Qing dynasty they founded ruled China until 1912. No, the Ming's fall was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling at the critical moment by natural disaster. One of which we've covered on this channel a few times is the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman spent most of the 17th century at what appeared to be the peak of its power. By 1683, it had absorbed massive territories in Hungary and southeastern Europe, slowly pushing north toward the strategic prize of Vienna. Taking Vienna would have opened the door to Central Europe, although the Ottomans had been turned back from Vienna once before in 1529. In 1683, they came back with an army estimated at over 100,000 men and laid siege to the city for 2 months. What broke the siege was one of the largest cavalry charges in European history. A coalition force led by the Polish king John III Sobieski arrived on September 12, 1683, and launched a downhill charge of around 18,000 winged hussars with allied cavalry into Ottoman lines. The Holy League that formed to push back the Ottomans after Vienna was a genuinely unusual coalition. European states that were simultaneously fighting each other elsewhere managed to coordinate enough to keep the pressure on. The Battle of Mohács in 1687 was a crushing Ottoman defeat. The decisive Battle of Zenta in 1697 produced a victory so complete that the Ottomans had no negotiating position left. Then the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 forced them to cede large portions of southern Europe. From Hungary, Transylvania to Podolia, all territory they had held for generations. For the first time in centuries, Ottoman expansion somehow found itself going backward. Finally, Isaac Newton is probably the most important and influential out of all. July 5, 1687, Isaac Newton publishes Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica. The full title translates to Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. It is widely considered one of the most important books ever written, which I know we say a lot, but this one is not an exaggeration. The Principia did several things simultaneously. It laid out Newton's 3 laws of motion, describing how objects move, how forces act on them, and how for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. It established his law of universal gravitation, mathematically explaining why objects fall toward Earth. Think about how important this is to you. It answers why the moon orbits the Earth, why the planets orbit the sun, and how the same force governs all of it. Without it, we wouldn't have developed mathematical methods until much later. Newton didn't do any of this in an overnight span. He was explicit about building on what came before. Newton read everything that came before it. Engaging with other perspectives allowed him to synthesize things into something that went further. He supposedly said he stood on the shoulders of giants. He was also genuinely difficult, while not above claiming credit aggressively when disputes arose. What the Principia established beyond the specific laws and equations was the idea that the physical universe operates according to mathematical principles. These are ones that human beings can discover and use to make accurate predictions. That idea sounds obvious now in hindsight, but obviously it wasn't obvious then. It was a proposition that needed to be demonstrated, and Newton demonstrated it more completely than anyone before him. But with respect to the others, the scientific revolution had many contributors. Newton's Principia was just the one that is most known. 7 events all in one century that isn't spoken about enough anymore. People skip over on their way from the Renaissance to the Industrial Revolution. England and Scotland joined under one crown. Russia survived its worst crisis and found a dynasty that would last 3 centuries. Europe fought itself for 30 years and invented the way of international law. 102 people crossed the Atlantic on a ship with a cracked beam and changed North America. One of China's greatest dynasties fell to a neighbor who had been waiting. The Ottoman Empire discovered its limit at the gates of Vienna, and one man sat down and mathematically described how the universe works.